On Florida's coastline, there's a mansion that doesn't look like a home. It looks like a promise, gold and marble arranged into a fairy tale fortress, rising from the shoreline like it was shipped in from another world. This is Mar-a-Lago, a place built to dazzle, but haunted by the questions it keeps creating. From the beginning, it was never just beautiful. It was built to be noticed. A palace designed to silence doubt. The moment someone stepped through the doors, crystal light scattering across polished floors, ceilings that seemed to glow, rooms arranged like chapters in a story about power. Yet outside those gates, America was living through hard decades. Economic fear, war shadows, and ordinary lives stretched thin. Inside, the music still played. Mar-a-Lago started as the dream of one woman, Marjorie Merriweather Post. She didn't want a winter house. She wanted an eternal throne, an address that could not be ignored, a stage grand enough to force history itself to look her way. But beneath the glamour was a wound she couldn't spend her way out of. The ache of being wealthy without being fully accepted, because money can open most doors. But in America's oldest social circles, some doors don't unlock with cash. They unlock with time, with lineage, with names that sit in history books, like they own the margins. Post had unimaginable wealth, yet she still felt the invisible wall invited, but never entirely inside. And so she chose the only solution she trusted. If they wouldn't truly welcome her, she would build something too massive to dismiss. Palm Beach in the 1920s was already becoming the winter playground of America's elite. The air was warm, the coastline dramatic, and the island was filling up with mansions belonging to families who carried the kind of serious money Post was never allowed to forget she didn't have. So she picked her ground carefully, a rare stretch of land reaching from ocean to lake, and decided her house would be bigger, bolder, and more unforgettable than anything around it. Mar-a-Lago wasn't meant to blend in, it was meant to overshadow. And that's the secret at the heart of this mansion's story. It wasn't built only for comfort or beauty. It was built as an argument made in stone, gold and imported marble, declaring, "You may not accept me, but you will never be able to ignore me." But when you build a palace for belonging, you sometimes create a different kind of loneliness, one that echoes louder in empty halls. And as this mansion changes hands across decades, that same echo will return in new forms: power meetings, scandals, investigations, and national anger, all circling the same question: how did a fairy tale palace become a battlefield of influence, secrets, and controversy? Before Mar-a-Lago became a headline, it was a feeling, a private ache dressed up as architecture. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born into comfort, but she didn't stay there. She exploded into a different category entirely. When her father died in 1914, she inherited the cereal fortune that would later connect to a giant food empire. She was still young, and overnight, the world around her changed. Not slowly, not politely. Suddenly she was one of the richest women in America, carrying a fortune so large it could bend any room, at least on paper. Money gave her estates. Money gave her art. Money gave her yachts, jewels, rare furniture, and invitations. But the strangest part of extreme wealth is this: it can buy access to nearly everything, while still failing to buy the one thing you can't order: unquestioned acceptance. Because in America's elite social world back then, there were categories of wealth, spoken and unspoken. There was old money, built over generations, polished by time, protected by names that acted like passports. And then there was new money, fresh, loud in the wrong way, earned in industries the old families secretly depended on, but didn't respect. Post's fortune came from cereal, breakfast sold in boxes to ordinary people. To her critics, that wasn't serious. It wasn't railroads, banks, or inherited empires that looked noble in history books. And even when she was invited into rooms full of famous names, she could feel it. The invisible line. They would smile. They would take her gifts. They would accept her presence. But they would not fully accept her. That kind of rejection doesn't just offend. It shapes a person. Especially someone with the power to fight back, using the only language the world around her truly respected spectacle. Post had taste, real taste. She collected treasures that belonged in museums. She surrounded herself with craftsmanship, culture, and beauty. But in those circles, taste was not the same as belonging. The rules weren't written, but everyone knew them. And so, somewhere around the mid-1920s, Post made a decision that wasn't just about building a home. It was about building a verdict. She chose Palm Beach for a reason. It was already becoming the winter kingdom of the elite. Sunlight, ocean air, and a coastline lined with mansions, owned by the very families who kept her at arm's length. So she didn't build beside them as an equal. She aimed to build above them. She found a rare stretch of land, narrow, dramatic, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean on one side to the inland waterway on the other. Sea to lake. A location so perfect it felt designed for a statement. And she paid for it, like someone trying to prove a point to history itself. Then she hired architects who could translate ambition into stone. Her instructions weren't subtle. She didn't ask for a pretty villa. She demanded a palace, Spanish and Moorish inspiration, European echoes, but scaled like an American challenge. A tower visible from the ocean, imported materials, gold leaf, grandeur that would not fade into the background. Mar-a-Lago was no longer just an idea. It became a mission. Build something so breathtaking that nobody could dismiss her again. But here's what Marjorie Post didn't fully realize yet. When you build a mansion to silence your critics, you also build a machine that never stops demanding more money, more labor, more upkeep, more illusion. And once construction begins, the dream starts to reveal its real cost. Construction on Mar-a-Lago began in 1925. And from the very first day, it was clear this was not the building of a house. It was the assembly of an entire imagined world, one that had to be shipped, piece by piece, across oceans. Marjorie Merriweather Post wanted authenticity, not imitation. Florida would not supply what she demanded, so the materials came from elsewhere. Tens of thousands of antique Spanish tiles were purchased from old estates and dismantled buildings across Spain. Stone for the exterior walls was quarried from sites that had supplied Mediterranean palaces centuries earlier. Wooden ceilings were carved by craftsmen in Italy, shaped by hands trained in traditions far older than America itself. Nothing was simple. Nothing was local. Everything had to be transported, protected, and assembled under brutal heat and relentless deadlines. The scale was staggering. The main house alone would eventually cover more than 60,000 square feet. A towering structure rose above the grounds, visible from the ocean like a marker claiming the land. The original design included more than 70 rooms, each planned as a performance space for wealth. Bedrooms dressed in silk, bathrooms tiled by hand, halls meant to impress before a single word was spoken. Even the furniture bent architecture to its will. One massive dining table was so heavy the floor beneath it had to be reinforced just to support its presence. Gold leaf ceilings caught and multiplied light. Ballrooms were designed not only for movement, but for spectacle, for the feeling of being small beneath grandeur. But what visitors would one day see was only the surface. Beneath Mar-a-Lago, an entirely separate world took shape: hidden corridors, service staircases, industrial kitchens, mechanical rooms filled with boilers, pumps, and early air conditioning systems. In the 1920s, air conditioning in Florida was nearly unheard of. Marjorie demanded it anyway. Comfort was not optional. The illusion had to hold, even in the heaviest heat. This invisible infrastructure mattered more than the marble above it. Without it, the fantasy would collapse. To build this world required people, hundreds of them. Local laborers, many of them Black and Hispanic men, did the hardest physical work under the Florida sun. Skilled craftsmen arrived from Europe and the northern United States, bringing techniques that justified Marjorie's obsession with authenticity. Payroll records suggest the workforce peaked at more than 200 workers during the most intense phases. The conditions were punishing. Heat pressed down constantly. Sandstone dust filled the air. Scaffolding rose high and unforgiving. Injuries were common: cuts from stone and glass, falls, exhaustion that bordered on collapse. Delays were expensive, and pressure to move faster never eased. The men who laid tile and lifted stone were building something magnificent, but history would not remember their names. The cost climbed relentlessly. By the time Mar-a-Lago neared completion in 1929, estimates placed the construction bill between $7 and $10 million, well over $150 million in today's money. And that figure didn't include the art, the furnishings, or the constant maintenance the property would require for the rest of its existence. Timing made the contrast impossible to ignore. Mar-a-Lago was finished just as the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began, while bread lines formed in American cities. Chandeliers were being polished in Palm Beach, while families struggled to afford food. Gold leaf ceilings caught the glow of electric light. To Marjorie, this wasn't hypocrisy. She believed her spending created jobs, kept money moving, supported artists and workers. In her mind, wealth justified itself by circulating. Whether the laborers who sweated through construction shared that view was never recorded. When Mar-a-Lago finally opened for its first full season, it stood complete, solid, radiant, overwhelming. A palace built to command attention in a country sliding into hardship. But completion did not bring closure. Because once the doors opened and the music began, a quieter question emerged, one that marble could not answer. Had she built something grand enough to erase the line between herself and the world that still hesitated to fully accept her? When Mar-a-Lago opened for its first full season in 1930, it did not feel like a new beginning. It felt like a performance finally ready for its audience. Each winter followed a ritual as precise as a clock. Weeks before Marjorie Merriweather Post arrived, the mansion began to wake up. Staff scrubbed every surface until the marble shone without a fingerprint. Windows were polished to erase the boundary between inside luxury and ocean light. Fresh flowers filled the halls, and kitchens were stocked as if preparing for a siege. Meat, wine, sugar, spices, everything required for months of entertaining. By the time Post's car passed through the gates, Mar-a-Lago appeared unchanged, perfect, as if it had been frozen in time, waiting only for her return. The illusion of effortlessness was complete. The guest lists were not casual. They were engineered. Diplomats and their spouses, business magnates, Hollywood names whose presence guaranteed gossip, and most prized of all, European aristocrats with titles that stretched back centuries. Counts, countesses, princes without kingdoms. Their accents, their manners, their lineage were currency. Having them at her table mattered more to Marjorie than almost anything else. Dinners were productions, not meals. 30 or 40 guests sat beneath carved ceilings at a table that seemed to go on forever. Courses arrived in perfect sequence, sometimes 7, sometimes more. Crystal glasses caught candlelight. Conversation stayed carefully controlled travel, art, society. Rumors whispered just loudly enough to be heard. Politics was touched only lightly. Controversy was avoided. The goal was harmony, elegance, and above all, the sense that this place existed above ordinary life. After dinner, guests drifted through the house. Music in the ballroom. Cards in private rooms. Laughter echoing against stone walls. From the outside, Mar-a-Lago appeared to be exactly what Marjorie had dreamed of. A center of importance. A gathering place for people who shaped the world. But the magic depended on something no guest was meant to see. Below the ballroom, the kitchens operated with near-military precision. Chefs commanded teams working 12-hour shifts in unbearable heat. Gas ranges burned constantly. Steam filled the air. Timing was ruthless. One mistake could disrupt the entire evening. Burns were common. Exhaustion was expected. Laundry rooms ran endlessly. Tablecloths, napkins, sheets from dozens of bedrooms, washed, pressed, folded, stored without a single wrinkle. The women who did this work arrived before dawn and left long after dark during the busiest weeks. Outside, groundskeepers trimmed the 17 acres with geometric exactness. Salt air attacked metal and stone every day, demanding constant repair. Palm trees were inspected for disease. The seawall was watched carefully, always under pressure from the ocean's patient force. Mechanical rooms roared out of sight. Boilers heated water for dozens of bathrooms. Early air conditioning units struggled against Florida humidity. Men worked in windowless spaces adjusting valves, and watching gauges so lights never failed and comfort never broke. The staff lived close, but separate. They moved through service corridors, staircases designed specifically so guests would not have to see them. They entered rooms silently, left without notice, learned to be present without being acknowledged. Their world existed parallel to the one upstairs, connected but never equal. By the standards of the time, Marjorie was considered a fair employer. She remembered names. She gave bonuses. She asked about families. But kindness did not erase hierarchy. Staff could polish the ballroom floor, but never dance on it. They could prepare feasts, but never sit at the table. Upstairs, champagne flowed. Downstairs, sweat-soaked uniforms. And still, the illusion worked. Guests left Mar-a-Lago, believing they had stepped into something rare and permanent. A world where elegance was effortless and abundance natural. They rarely thought about the labor that made it possible. Late at night, after the last guest had gone to bed and the final dish was washed, the mansion changed again. Silence filled the halls, and sometimes Marjorie walked those rooms alone. In that quiet, the question returned. Had she succeeded? Had the palace finally made her belong? Or had she only built a stage that required endless effort to keep applause alive? The walls never answered, and as the world beyond Palm Beach darkened, that silence would grow heavier. By the late 1930s, Mar-a-Lago looked eternal. Stone walls gleamed. The tower still watched the ocean. Each winter season unfolded as smoothly as the last. From the outside, it appeared that Marjorie Merriweather Post had succeeded. She had built something too solid, too magnificent to ever fade. But permanence is an illusion that only works when the world cooperates. Beyond Palm Beach, the world was changing fast. Europe was sliding toward war. Dictators rose. Borders hardened. In the United States, debates about isolation and involvement filled newspapers and dinner tables. Anxiety traveled quietly, even into rooms where champagne still flowed. At Mar-a-Lago, the parties continued. The guest lists shifted slightly, fewer European aristocrats, more American industrialists, military officers, and political figures, but the rituals remained. Dinner at 8, music afterward. A shared assumption that this world of wealth and elegance existed outside history's reach. Marjorie wanted to believe that. She had poured too much of herself into the mansion not to. To her, Mar-a-Lago was stone and craftsmanship, things that endured. Fashion faded. Politics shifted. But marble and gold felt permanent. That belief shaped how she faced the gathering storms. She did not retreat. She did not downsize. She doubled down on consistency, keeping the seasons alive, as if routine itself could hold chaos at bay. Then came December 1941. When the United States entered World War II, Palm Beach changed overnight. Young men from staff families enlisted or were drafted. Rationing reached even the grandest homes. Sugar, butter, gasoline, suddenly limited. Carefully counted. The Coast Guard began patrolling Florida's shores. German submarines were reported uncomfortably close to the Atlantic coast. For the first time, the ocean that made Mar-a-Lago beautiful also made it vulnerable. The mansion was offered to the government for potential wartime use. After inspection, it was quietly rejected. Too conspicuous, too difficult to defend, too impractical for real military operations. The palace built to signal strength was, in strategic terms, fragile. Marjorie did not withdraw. She threw herself into wartime efforts, funding medical supplies, hosting benefits, supporting war bond drives. Parts of her other estates were turned into recovery spaces for wounded soldiers. These efforts were genuine, not symbolic. Yet even as she contributed, Mar-a-Lago itself began to reveal a truth she had never wanted to face. Without constant care, grandeur decays quickly. Staff shortages meant some rooms went unused. Salt air attacked metal left unpolished. Mechanical systems needed parts that were now diverted to war production. Early air conditioning units struggled. Paint peeled. Stone weathered. For the first time since its completion, the mansion looked tired. Marjorie was aging too. By the mid-1940s, she was nearing 60. Her marriage to Joseph Davies was strained. Her children were building lives that did not revolve around Palm Beach society. The social universe she had fought so hard to enter was losing its grip on America's imagination. Hollywood, technology, and new industries were rewriting the rules of prestige. And that forced a new, quieter question to the surface. If Mar-a-Lago outlived her, and it would, who would want it? The mansion consumed money at a relentless pace. Taxes, staff, repairs, utilities. Costs that climbed year after year. Even for one of the wealthiest women in the country, The burden was heavy. And worse, her children did not want it. To them, Mar-a-Lago was not a dream fulfilled. It was an obligation, a massive, expensive monument to a social battle they had never chosen to fight. The permanence Marjorie believed she had built into stone was beginning to crack, not physically yet, but emotionally. The house still stood. The parties still happened, but the certainty was gone. Mar-a-Lago was no longer just a palace. It was becoming a question passed forward in time, waiting for an answer its creator could no longer clearly imagine. By the early 1970s, Marjorie Merriweather Post was running out of time. She was in her mid-80s. Her health was fading. The social world she had spent her life trying to conquer no longer looked the same, and Mar-a-Lago, once a declaration of strength, had become a looming responsibility. The mansion still stood in all its splendor, but splendor now came with a bill that never stopped arriving. Maintenance alone cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Staff payrolls were heavy. Property taxes climbed. Repairs were constant. Salt air never slept. And the most painful truth had settled in quietly. Her children did not want the house. Mar-a-Lago was Marjorie's dream, not theirs. A dream built to heal her wound, not one they felt obligated to inherit. So she searched for a solution worthy of the mansion's scale, something that would give it meaning beyond her lifetime. And she found one that felt perfect, even noble. She would give Mar-a-Lago to the United States government. In her vision, the mansion would finally become what she had always believed it should be: a winter White House, a presidential retreat where American leaders could host foreign dignitaries, conduct diplomacy in beauty, and showcase the nation's confidence and cultural power. It was not a wild idea. Presidents had relied on private retreats before. Franklin Roosevelt had Warm Springs. Harry Truman escaped to Key West. A Florida presidential residence seemed logical: sun, security, separation from Washington's pressure. In 1973, Marjorie wrote it into her will. Upon her death, Mar-a-Lago, along with its furnishings, art, and collections, would pass intact to the federal government. She wasn't offering just a building. She was offering a fully staged world. Marjorie died on September 12, 1973. Almost immediately, government agencies began evaluating the gift. What they found was beautiful and devastating. The National Park Service inspection report was thorough, respectful, and ultimately fatal to the idea. Yes, Mar-a-Lago was architecturally significant. Yes, it was historic. Yes, it was stunning. But it was also spectacularly impractical. The projected annual operating cost ranged from $1 to $2 million. Just to keep the lights on, the staff paid, and the building functional. That did not include major renovations, hurricane damage, or long-term structural repairs. Security was even worse. The mansion sat on a narrow strip of land with water on both sides. Multiple access points. Long, difficult to secure perimeters. Turning it into a presidential, grade-secure facility would require walls, checkpoints, surveillance systems, and guard posts. Millions more in costs and changes that would destroy the very elegance the gift was meant to preserve. There were logistical problems too. Palm Beach was essentially an island, connected by a few bridges. Evacuations during hurricanes or emergencies would be complex. The nearest major airport and military support were miles away. And then there were the neighbors. Palm Beach residents had tolerated private wealth. A permanent federal compound with checkpoints, motorcades, and restricted zones was another matter entirely. Town officials made their opposition clear. After years of legal and administrative debate, the verdict arrived. The federal government declined the gift. In 1981, Mar-a-Lago was formally returned to the Post estate. It was a rejection that echoed her life's deepest wound. She had built something magnificent. She had offered it to the nation. And still, no one wanted to take responsibility for it. The mansion faced the same problem Marjorie herself had faced for decades: too much, too costly, too demanding, too tied to one person's vision. Through the early 1980s, Mar-a-Lago sat mostly empty. A skeleton staff kept basic systems alive. Wings were closed off. Dust settled on once polished surfaces. Gardens crept toward wildness. Saltwater continued its quiet attack. The palace was still beautiful. But beauty without purpose decays fast. And just as the mansion seemed destined to fade into an expensive footnote of American excess, a new figure appeared. Young, ambitious, and obsessed with visibility. Someone who didn't see Mar-a-Lago as a burden, but as an opportunity. When Donald Trump first saw Mar-a-Lago in 1985, the mansion was no longer a dream. It was a problem. The Post estate needed a buyer. The government didn't want it. Maintenance costs were crushing. What had once been a throne now felt like an anchor, dragging value downward year after year. To most investors, Mar-a-Lago made no sense. It was too large, too expensive, too impractical to ever be a normal private residence again. Trump saw something different. At 39 years old, he was already famous. Towering buildings in Manhattan, his name stamped in gold, constant media attention. But New York was crowded with power. Old money, old reputations. Florida offered something cleaner: space, sunlight, and a chance to own something singular. His first move was classic Trump, aggressive and unsettling. He offered $500 million for Mar-a-Lago, a number that was almost insulting compared to its original cost. The estate executives refused. Trump responded by buying the oceanfront land directly in front of the mansion for about $2,000 million. He announced plans to build high-rise condominiums there, structures that would block Mar-a-Lago's ocean view and collapse its remaining prestige. Whether he truly intended to build them or simply wanted leverage is still debated. What matters is that it worked. Faced with the prospect of their palace becoming a landlocked relic, the estate came back to the table. Later in 1985, Trump acquired Mar-a-Lago and much of its original furnishings for roughly $800 million, a fraction of what it had cost to build. But owning the mansion immediately created the same problem that had defeated everyone before him. Mar-a-Lago burned money. Property taxes were enormous. Staffing costs were unavoidable. Maintenance never stopped. Trump quickly realized that living there full-time was impractical, even for him. The mansion was not a home, it was infrastructure. So he did what he did best. He turned status into revenue. In 1995, Trump began converting Mar-a-Lago into a private club. He invested several $1 million renovating decayed systems, modernizing kitchens, upgrading electrical work, restoring neglected rooms. But he left the core intact: the ballroom, the gold ceilings, the imported tiles. These were not liabilities. They were the product. Membership was the key. At first, the initiation fee was around $100,000, later rising to $200,000, with annual dues added on top. Members gained access to the mansion, the restaurants, the pool, the beach, and most importantly, to the idea of Mar-a-Lago. Trump marketed it relentlessly. Magazine spreads, interviews, carefully staged photos of himself inside the estate. The message was consistent. This was not just a club. It was an inner circle. Palm Beach's old institutions, the Bath and Tennis Club, the Everglades Club, had long guarded their membership lists and traditions. Some had histories of exclusion that were becoming harder to defend publicly. Trump positioned Mar-a-Lago as the alternative. Membership would be open regardless of religion or race. Whether this was principle, strategy, or both hardly mattered. The strategy worked. Within a few years, Mar-a-Lago had hundreds of members. Initiation fees alone brought in tens of millions of dollars. Annual dues created steady cash flow. Trump had solved the mansion's central problem by doing something Marjorie Merriweather Post never could. He made other people pay to maintain the dream. But the club was never just a business. Trump used Mar-a-Lago as a stage. He hosted high-profile parties designed for headlines. He invited athletes, entertainers, politicians, anyone whose presence reinforced the idea that important things happened here. Interviews were given on site, always framed by marble and gold. Slowly, the mansion changed again. It was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It was becoming a symbol of access. And access, in America, is often more valuable than money. Mar-a-Lago was finally achieving what Marjorie had always wanted: relevance, influence, attention. But it was doing so in a way she never imagined, one that blurred lines between private luxury and public power. And soon, those lines would disappear almost completely. The election of 2016 changed Mar-a-Lago's meaning overnight. When Donald Trump won the presidency, the mansion that had once been rejected as too impractical for government use suddenly became something far more powerful than an official designation. Mar-a-Lago became the de facto winter White House, not by law, but by habit, visibility, and insistence. Trump made it clear early on. He would spend significant time there. He would host foreign leaders there. He would work there. What Marjorie Merriweather Post had imagined decades earlier, presidential importance flowing through her halls, finally arrived, though in a form she never could have predicted. With that decision came consequences. Security transformed the estate almost instantly. The Secret Service expanded its presence. Checkpoints appeared on surrounding streets. Coast Guard boats patrolled offshore waters. Airspace above the property was restricted whenever the president was in residence. Palm Beach, once quiet and carefully controlled, became a recurring lockdown zone. The costs were immense. Each presidential visit required millions of dollars in federal spending for protection, logistics, and coordination. Unlike Marjorie's rejected gift to the government, these costs were now unavoidable and paid by taxpayers. What had once been a private club was now partially functioning as a seat of government. Palm Beach residents were furious. Road closures disrupted daily life. Helicopters shattered the town's calm. Lawsuits followed, complaints about noise, traffic, and declining property values. Local officials debated whether Trump could legally claim Mar-a-Lago as his primary residence, citing deed restrictions that limited the property's use as a private club rather than a full-time home. But the most important shift wasn't logistical, it was symbolic. Mar-a-Lago became a national shorthand for America's political divide. To Trump's supporters, the mansion represented success. Proof that a businessman had risen to the presidency without surrendering his private empire. Hosting foreign leaders in a gold-lined ballroom felt, to them, like confidence, private wealth standing shoulder to shoulder with public power. To critics, it represented something far darker. The president owned the club. The club sold memberships. Membership now offered proximity, not guaranteed influence, but closeness. After the election, the initiation fee reportedly doubled to 200,000, transforming social access into something that looked dangerously like political currency. Foreign officials stayed there. Corporate interests hosted events. Government business unfolded within earshot of paying members. Conversations that would normally happen behind secure doors took place at dinner tables, surrounded by guests. One moment crystallized the concern. In February 2017, Trump hosted Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at Mar-a-Lago. During dinner on an outdoor terrace, surrounded by club members, news arrived that North Korea had launched a ballistic missile. Trump and Abe discussed the situation at the table. Photos later surfaced showing documents in view, members watching, phones out. The outrage was immediate. Security experts called it reckless. Ethics watchdogs demanded investigations. Even some political allies expressed discomfort. Trump dismissed the criticism as partisan noise, insisting Mar-a-Lago was secure and that nothing improper had occurred. But the incident revealed something deeper. Mar-a-Lago was no longer just a mansion or a club. It had become a collision point where presidential power, private profit, national security, and spectacle all occupied the same physical space. The very features that made the mansion glamorous, openness, access, performance, were now liabilities. A building designed for display was being asked to hold secrecy. A club designed for social mixing was hosting matters of state. Marjorie Merriweather Post had wanted her palace to matter. Now it mattered more than ever. And the cost of that relevance was only beginning to surface. The moment that permanently changed Mar-a-Lago arrived quietly, in cardboard boxes. When Donald Trump left the White House in January 2021, he took more than personal belongings with him. Thousands of government documents traveled south to Florida, packed into ordinary boxes, and moved into a building designed for weddings, dinners, and club events, not national secrets. At first, almost no one knew. The boxes were stored in various locations around Mar-a-Lago. A basement storage room, back areas of the property, and, according to later court filings, even the ballroom. The same room that once hosted orchestras and diplomats now held materials the government considered among its most sensitive. Months passed. Then the National Archives noticed something was wrong. Presidential records, documents that by law belonged to the United States, were missing. Requests were made. Negotiations followed. In January 2022, Trump's representatives returned 15 boxes to the archives. Inside, officials found classified materials. That discovery changed everything. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. Subpoenas were issued. Lawyers searched Mar-a-Lago and assured the government that all remaining classified documents had been returned. A sworn certification was provided saying exactly that. It wasn't true. Investigators developed evidence that additional classified materials were still on the property. On August 8, 2022, FBI agents executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago, an event without precedent in American history. No former president had ever been searched this way. Agents spent hours moving through the mansion, documenting rooms, opening storage areas, and collecting evidence. When they left, they had recovered more than 100 additional classified documents. including materials marked at the highest levels of secrecy, documents involving national defense, intelligence sources, and sensitive foreign policy information. Photographs later released in court filings showed files spread across floors, classification stamps clearly visible, top secret, SCI, sensitive compartmented information. These were documents meant to be stored only in secure government facilities, now found in a social club accessible to members, staff, event workers, and guests. The reaction was explosive. Trump called the search a raid and accused federal agents of misconduct. He claimed documents had been planted. He argued he had declassified the materials, though no evidence of formal declassification was produced. Supporters rallied outside the gates. Conservative media framed the investigation as political persecution. Critics saw something else entirely. A former president had removed classified materials, resisted returning them, allowed false statements to be made to federal authorities, and stored sensitive intelligence in a property never designed for secure handling of state secrets. In June 2023, a federal grand jury indicted Trump on the 37 felony counts, including willful retention of national defense information and obstruction of justice. Additional charges followed. The case landed in federal court in Florida, with pretrial motions stretching on and trial dates shifting. Through it all, Mar-a-Lago remained open. Weddings were booked. Members dined on the terrace. Staff polished floors. The ballroom, once a symbol of opulence, now appeared repeatedly in legal filings, transformed into either a crime scene or a symbol of government overreach. Depending on who was speaking, the mansion had reached a strange peak. It was simultaneously a luxury club, a former president's residence, a site of federal investigation, and a political battleground fought nightly on television. The place built to project power had become evidence in a national reckoning over power itself. And still, beneath the shouting, one simple fact remained unchanged: classified documents had been stored in a party palace. What that would ultimately cost, legally, politically, historically, was still unresolved. But Mar-a-Lago had crossed a line from symbol to flashpoint, from stage to central exhibit. The final chapter would not be about what happened inside its walls, but about what its story revealed outside them. After the sirens faded and the headlines moved on to the next outrage, Mar-a-Lago remained where it had always been, on its narrow strip of land between ocean and waterway, polished, guarded, functioning. Weddings still filled the ballroom. Club members still posed on terraces. Staff still arrived before sunrise to prepare rooms few Americans would ever enter. The machinery never stopped, and that continuity revealed the final truth about Mar-a-Lago. This mansion was never just a place. It was a mirror, reflecting America back to itself, depending on who was looking. To some, Mar-a-Lago represented ambition rewarded. A woman built a palace to prove her worth. A businessman turned an unwanted relic into a profitable brand. A president governed from a private estate and defied convention. In this version of the story, wealth was vision, success was destiny, and criticism was envy. To others, the same building told a darker story. Extreme wealth turned into insulation from consequence. Private luxury blurred into public power. Access was sold. Rules bent. Secrets drifted into spaces built for spectacle. In that version, Mar-a-Lago was not a triumph, but a warning. Both stories contained truth. Neither told the whole thing. Because beneath every version of Mar-a-Lago Lago's meaning was something quieter and far more consistent labor. For nearly a century, the mansion survived only because people showed up every day to keep it alive. Workers whose names never made headlines cleaned rooms, repaired systems, trimmed gardens, cooked meals, handled logistics, and absorbed pressure whenever controversy reached the gates. Their reality barely changed whether the owner was a serial heiress or a president. The patterns repeated. Marjorie Merriweather Post built Mar-a-Lago to force belonging, and discovered that acceptance cannot be purchased. Donald Trump used Mar-a-Lago as a stage and proved that spectacle can amplify power but cannot control its consequences. In different ways, both poured ambition into stone, and both learned that buildings magnify human flaws as easily as human dreams. The mansion also exposed something deeper about America itself. It showed how easily wealth becomes authority, how quickly access turns into influence, how rarely labor is acknowledged when luxury is admired, how symbols distract from systems, and it revealed how fragile permanence really is. Mar-a-Lago stands on a barrier island, increasingly threatened by rising seas and stronger storms. No amount of gold leaf can negotiate with physics. The ocean pressing against the seawall does not care about politics, ownership, or legacy. One day, the same forces that ignore power will test the mansion's foundations in ways no courtroom ever could. Mar-a-Lago will outlast its current owner. It may outlast the scandals. It may even outlast the era that made it infamous. What it becomes next, museum, club, relic, or ruin, will depend on choices still being made. And that is the final lesson of Mar-a-Lago. Buildings don't decide what they mean. People do. What Americans choose to remember about this mansion, what they praise, what they excuse, what they ignore, will say far more about the country than about the house itself. Because Mar-a-Lago was never just a fairy tale palace. It was a reflection.